The courtroom was buzzing with energy. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the trial to begin. But today, this wasn't just any ordinary case. It was one of those rare moments when the world outside the court had taken a keen interest. And the reason was simple. Al Pacino was sitting among the defendants. Yes, the Al Pacino. The man who had made history with iconic roles like Michael Corleone in The Godfather, Tony Montana in Scarface, and countless other unforgettable characters. He wasn't there to act though. He was there as a defendant in a legal battle. Nobody really knew the details of the case, but that didn't matter. Just his presence alone had the room packed with journalists, cameras, and people eager to catch a glimpse of the Hollywood legend. On the other side of the courtroom sat the opposing lawyer. He was known for his ruthless tactics in the courtroom. No mercy, no hesitation. His reputation was that of a man who played dirty to win. Someone who could break down even the toughest opponents. And today he had a target, Al Pacino. With a sharp smile, the lawyer glanced over at Pacino. He was ready to tear him apart, not with legal arguments, but with mockery. He believed he had the upper hand, but what he didn't know was that he was about to encounter something far beyond his expectations. The courtroom quieted as the lawyer stood up, his voice booming through the silent room. His eyes locked onto Al Pacino, a smirk forming on his lips. He was about to make his move. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lawyer began, pacing back and forth, "today we have the pleasure of having a true Hollywood icon here with us." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, savoring the attention. Al Pacino, a man who made his name in the world of make-believe, playing characters so larger than life that even the real world can't seem to compete. There was a slight chuckle from the audience. The lawyer seemed to feed off it, turning toward Pacino. "I'm sure you've all seen his films, right? I mean, who could forget Scarface? A man so tough, so fearless, that he somehow manages to take over an entire city. But in reality, Mr. Pacino, you're just another defendant in my courtroom. No amount of Hollywood magic is going to save you now." The lawyer's words were sharp, designed to sting. He went on, mocking Pacino's famous roles one by one. And The Godfather, a man of family, honor, respect. Too bad those values don't quite fit in a courtroom like this, huh? Maybe it's time to leave the Don Corleone routine at home. The courtroom laughed again, this time louder. The lawyer's mocking tone was starting to get under the skin of some people in the room. But Pacino, he just sat there, calm as ever, his eyes fixed forward. He didn't react to the insults, not a twitch on his face. The lawyer's words grew bolder, more biting. "I wonder, Mr. Pacino, did you bring your Oscar-winning skills to this case today? Or is that just for the screen? I mean, what kind of man is really behind those larger-than-life characters? Let's find out, shall we?" The room was filled with an uncomfortable tension. Some looked at each other, unsure how Pacino would respond to such an attack. The lawyer, now feeling confident, took his seat. He had done what he set out to do: mock, humiliate, and diminish the man who was once the face of Hollywood's greatest films. But as the lawyer settled into his chair, he didn't realize one thing: Al Pacino wasn't your typical defendant. For a moment the courtroom was still, the mocking laughter had died down, but the tension lingered in the air. All eyes turned to Al Pacino, waiting to see how he would react. Would he snap? Would he rise to the lawyer's bait? But Pacino didn't move. He simply sat there, his hands folded calmly in front of him. The Hollywood legend, the man who had played some of the most iconic characters in film history, was now just a man in a courtroom. A man who was about to show everyone what he was truly made of. Slowly Pacino stood up from his seat. His movements were deliberate, controlled. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't flustered. The room fell silent again, every ear tuned to hear what he would say. "I have to admit," Pacino began, his voice smooth but firm. "You're right, I've played some very big characters on screen. Characters who've been larger than life, who've had to make tough choices and face impossible odds." He paused, looking around the room, his gaze sweeping over the jury, the judge, and even the lawyer who had just insulted him. "But let me tell you something," he continued, his voice never raising, never wavering. "What I've learned in all those years of playing those characters, what I've learned from the scripts I've read, and the roles I've taken, is that those larger-than-life people, they're not so different from the people sitting here in this room today. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto the lawyer. The truth is, every single person in this courtroom, every person who's ever faced a challenge in their life, has had to make decisions. They've had to face their fears, confront their weaknesses, and do what they thought was right. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us real. The courtroom was quiet now. Everyone was hanging on his every word. Pacino wasn't just speaking as an actor anymore. He was speaking as a man who understood something deeper than the surface. And as for me, Pacino continued, his voice steady, I've spent my career studying people. I've spent my career understanding the complexities of human nature, and I can tell you this. What you see in the movies, what you see in those characters, is just one part of the story. The real story is what happens off camera, when the lights are off, and when the world isn't watching. There was a moment of silence. Pacino's words were simple, yet profound. He wasn't just responding to the lawyer's insults. He was challenging the very idea that a person's value could be measured by their past, or their reputation. The lawyer, who had been so confident moments ago, now looked uncertain. He didn't know how to respond to that. Pacino stood tall, his expression calm. He had made his point, and he wasn't done yet. Pacino paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle in the air. The silence in the courtroom was palpable. It wasn't just the calm demeanor he carried, it was the weight of his words. People had expected a typical response, perhaps an outburst or a defense, but instead they got something deeper. Something far more impactful. Then, with a slight smile, Pacino continued, his voice a little quieter, but no less powerful. You know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the roles I've played over the years, and in a way, each character was like a puzzle, a challenge. But more than that, they've taught me something crucial about human behavior, about how we act when the pressure is on, when the stakes are high, when we have no choice but to make the hard decisions. He took another step forward, his eyes now fixed firmly on the lawyer. The man who had mocked him, who had thought he could easily break the legend. Pacino's gaze softened, but there was an undeniable intensity in it. And that's where I see something that's not so different from what you do in here, in your courtroom. Pacino said, his voice gaining a quiet strength. You deal with human beings. People who, like the characters I've played, are pushed to their limits. They have to navigate their own stories, their own choices. Some rise above, some fall. But it's all part of the game, isn't it? The lawyer's smirk faded. He shifted in his seat, unsure of what to make of this. Was Pacino suggesting something about him? Was he actually talking about the law? Pacino stepped even closer to the table, his tone now more serious. I've played tough guys. The ones who don't flinch when things get ugly. But here's the thing, what you don't see in those films, what you don't see on the screen, is the moment before. The moment when everything changes. That's the real battle. That's the true test. And in that moment, it's not about how loud you shout, or how powerful you appear. It's about understanding the human condition. The room had grown so quiet that you could hear the soft shuffle of papers from the clerk's desk. No one dared interrupt him. His words were slicing through the tension like a knife. It was like watching a master craftsman at work, shaping the truth with each carefully chosen phrase. Pacino turned briefly to the jury, his voice still calm, but now carrying a hint of a challenge. What's really being judged here is not the surface, not the fame or the roles I've played. It's the choices I make in this room, right now. In this moment. And it's the same for every person in this courtroom. You're all making decisions. And whether you realize it or not, those choices will define your story. The lawyer was starting to look uneasy. His earlier confidence had begun to crack. He'd expected Pacino to get defensive, to fight back with fire. But Pacino wasn't fighting. He was observing, analyzing, and drawing connections between the real world and the roles he'd played in movies. Pacino's voice dropped slightly, as he made the final connection. You see, Mr. Lawyer, I've lived my life in characters who've made difficult choices. But you're playing a role too. You're playing the part of someone who believes they hold all the power in this room. But in reality, you're just a man trying to manipulate the story. Trying to control how the plot unfolds. A murmur ran through the courtroom. People looked at each other, sensing the shift in the room. It was as if the tide had changed, and now the lawyer was the one under scrutiny, not Pacino. Pacino's words had unraveled something deeper, something that no one had expected. He wasn't just responding to the lawyer's jabs, he was questioning the very nature of control, of power, and of the roles we all play in the grand story of life. And now it was clear the lawyer's arrogance had backfired. The judge, who had been observing quietly, shifted in his seat. Even he seemed to acknowledge the brilliance of Pacino's response. The room was electric with tension. The lawyer, who had been so confident just moments ago, was now visibly unsettled. He shifted in his seat, trying to maintain his composure, but there was no mistaking it. He was caught off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. It was as if Pacino had taken all the wind out of his sails, with those few well-crafted powerful lines. The lawyer, the man known for his ability to tear down anyone who stood in his way, suddenly looked vulnerable. He glanced over at the judge, as if searching for some reassurance. But the judge remained still, his eyes focused on Pacino, a slight nod of respect barely perceptible. The lawyer's gaze flickered back to Pacino, and for the first time he seemed uncertain. His sharp, biting remarks had failed, and now he was left to regroup, to find a way to regain the upper hand. But the damage had already been done. Pacino's response had not only disarmed him, it had exposed a vulnerability the lawyer hadn't expected. This wasn't just about a legal case anymore, it had turned into a battle of wits, a psychological showdown that Pacino had already won with grace. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to reassert control over the room. He straightened his suit, adjusting his tie as if preparing for a new round. But the confidence he had earlier was gone, replaced by a slight crack in his otherwise perfect exterior. His posture, once so confident and commanding, now appeared forced. He tried to recover, but his next words came out softer, less sure. "Well, Mr. Pacino, it seems I underestimated you." The sarcasm was still there, but it lacked the sharp edge it had before. It was clear, Pacino had left him speechless, and the lawyer was struggling to find his footing. The judge, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, now slowly adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had been watching perhaps more intently than anyone in the room. The tension between Pacino and the lawyer was palpable, and it was clear the courtroom was on the edge of its seat, waiting for the next move. For a brief moment, it seemed like the judge would say nothing, perhaps to allow the lawyer to recover, to let the courtroom regain some sense of order. But instead, the judge's gaze shifted to the lawyer, who was still fumbling to find his footing. "Mr. Lawson," the judge said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I believe we can all agree that this courtroom is not a place for theatrics." The lawyer flinched slightly at the mention of his name. It wasn't harsh, just a simple observation that carried an unmistakable edge. The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. The judge turned his eyes toward Pacino. "Mr. Pacino," he began, "you've just demonstrated something that I think we can all appreciate here today. A man who can stand his ground with such poise and insight, even when faced with mockery, is a rare thing." The room held its breath. The judge's words were measured, but the respect in his tone was unmistakable. The lawyer, who had been expecting a reprimand for Pacino's bold response, found himself on the receiving end of an entirely different judgment. "I'm sure we all realize," the judge continued, "that sometimes the most powerful response is not a confrontation, but an understanding of the bigger picture. Pacino, your words were not just clever, they were a reminder of what truly matters in this room. The pursuit of truth, the pursuit of fairness." The courtroom was quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't filled with tension, it was filled with a sense of awe. Even the lawyer seemed to shrink back, as if the judge's acknowledgement of Pacino had somehow stripped away his earlier bravado. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. The lawyer opened his mouth once more, but no words came. He simply sat back in his chair, eyes downcast. The judge's quiet praise had turned the tide in Pacino's favor, and it was clear that whatever had happened in this room, the courtroom now belonged to the actor. The courtroom had changed completely. What had started as a tense confrontational atmosphere now felt calm, almost reflective. The lawyer, once so full of himself, was reduced to silence, his earlier confidence shattered. Even the judge, who had been a passive observer at first, now carried an air of quiet respect. Al Pacino, on the other hand, had done nothing more than speak his truth. His calm, measured response had won over the room, not with anger, but with understanding. The way he had turned the situation around, without ever raising his voice, was a testament to the strength of his character. The jury, who had been observing the entire exchange, shifted in their seats. Some exchanged glances, as if to say, "This isn't just about the case anymore." They were witnessing something far deeper, something that transcended the courtroom. Pacino's unshaken confidence had not only earned him the respect of the judge, but also shifted the power dynamic in the room. The lawyer, who thought he had the upper hand, had been forced to acknowledge that he was outmatched, not by Pacino's fame, but by his wisdom and composure. As the trial resumed, it was clear that this moment would be remembered long after the case was over. For today, Al Pacino had won more than just a legal battle. He had proven that sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply be themselves.